Welcome to today's podcast, Solving the Productivity Challenge, part of our Industry 4 Ready podcast series. Today we learn about the state of UK manufacturing and productivity. We're going to explore digital solutions and how they can boost competitiveness through the changing landscape of COVID-19 and Brexit. I'm your host, Nick Davis, Deloitte's UK Industry 4 leader. UK manufacturing productivity hasn't recovered since the 2008 global financial crisis, when average growth or output per hour worked fell from 4.7% a year to just 0.5% a year. While the need to boost UK productivity existed pre-COVID-19, the ongoing pandemic and fast approaching Brexit really threatens higher operating costs alongside a host of new challenges for business. To share their views on the role digital can play in lifting productivity, what the government is doing to support UK manufacturing, and successes they're seeing, I'm delighted to be joined by Ian, Jan and Chris. And perhaps we can start with a few introductions.
Hello, Nick. Well, I'm the Chief Economist at Deloitte, Ian Stewart, and I guess my role is to try to understand how the world of economics and finance affects business and the opportunities companies face. And within that, productivity is one of the key issues that we've been looking at over the last 10 years.
Hi, I'm Janet Godsell, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at WMG University of Warwick. I focus on the alignment between product marketing and supply chain strategy and the role that they play in delivering customer responsiveness. I'm also a co-chair of a global research priority at the University of Warwick, which is focusing on looking at the relationship between productivity, well-being and the future of work. And actually, just building on what Ian said, we're actually doing some really interesting work at the moment, trying to develop an economic measure of supply chain productivity.
I'm Chris Courtney. I'm the Challenge Director for Manufacturing Made Smarter. Manufacturing Made Smarter is the UK's innovation programme for digital manufacturing and supply chains.
Thank you all, and thank you for joining today. Just to start, Ian, perhaps we could start with a question for you. Could you maybe just give us an overview of the economic context and a view around UK manufacturing and this productivity challenge?
Yeah, well, I mean, for economists, productivity is absolutely everything, because in the long term, what moves the dial in terms of incomes and human progress is growth in productivity. Now, within that, manufacturing is tremendously important because the scope for increasing productivity in manufacturing is higher than it is in the service sector. Manufacturing is more capital intensive. There's greater opportunities for labour substitution and for the application of technology. So it's a huge issue. Now, I think the sort of central problem is twofold. One is that over time, UK manufacturing productivity has tended to lag behind the best internationally, our major peers such as Germany, the US and France. I think the second problem, and you alluded to this in your introduction, is that since the global financial crisis, productivity in the UK has almost flatlined, and it's flatlined across the board, but especially in manufacturing. So I think we've got a problem internationally, which is long-standing in nature, and we have a new problem, which has come into being really since the financial crisis 12 years ago.
Thanks, Ian. It's a interesting perspective around the longer-term challenge as well as the immediate or more recent challenges as well. Jan, it'd be good to get your perspective. What role does digital have in kind of addressing some of these long-standing and more recent challenges?
So last year, WMG, in conjunction with WBS, our business school, we did a piece of research for the Gatsby Foundation looking at productivity across 6 manufacturing sectors. And it's really interesting because although productivity is used at a macro level by the government, a sort of global value added per head type of calculation, actually when you ask manufacturing organisations what they think of productivity, they actually think much more about performance. And they use very different language and different measures, look really at the effectiveness and the efficiency of their manufacturing operations. And when we look at manufacturing internally first, the first issue that you see is very poor internal integration. So you get functional silos. And a lot of this is because of the way that we use measures, and especially smart targets, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely targets, to drive functional optimization. And so even within organisations, we end up with poor integration, poor effectiveness and efficiency because of that siloed approach. So the first way that digital technologies can be used are to actually overcome some of those internal integration issues and to actually perhaps use data. And we did a survey 18 months ago where we surveyed, I think it's about 170 manufacturing firms. And what we found is that the technologies they're currently using are to essentially build a data backbone and then to essentially perhaps extend that data through sensor and other technologies, and then develop data analytics capability to analyze that data better to be able to essentially achieve some degree of internal optimization. And what that will create is a bedrock of operational efficiency, free up some cash for them then to invest in some other digital technologies. And there's two ways they could then look to invest. The second, which is perhaps the most exciting for me and my interest in end-to-end supply chains, is how they then look to actually optimize the end-to-end supply chain, not just their own organization. And then the third would be the way that they can use digital technologies, perhaps more in a pilot way, to try out new things. Now, if that's on a fairly small basis, they might do that internally in a sort of sandpit. But what we're increasingly seeing that if you're going to use digital technologies in a more radical way, it's likely to impact on the generation of a new business model. And so we're actually seeing a trend for larger organizations to actually set up a skunk works or spin-off or other bit of their organization where they can actually try to use digital technologies to enable new business models to really create a breakthrough in productivity.
Fantastic. Some really great concepts and ideas there as well, Jan. Ian, your thoughts on some of Jan's commentary there?
Yeah, well, I suppose from an economic point of view, Nick, to me, the sort of central paradox about technology is that, in the last 10 years, we've seen all sorts of ways in which, even as consumers, technology has changed our lives. And I think that would tend to make one believe that technology is having a very big effect in the production process and in driving productivity. And yet we're not seeing it. And that's a kind of strange paradox. It's not a new one at all. It's something that Robert Solow, and the US economist, talked about in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, there's a lot of talk about how we were seeing transformational technological change, but it just wasn't coming through in the manufacturing productivity numbers. Now, it may be that part of the problem is we're mismeasuring productivity. I think another possibility may just be that it takes an awful long time to rearrange work around new technology and deploy new technology to extract productivity growth. And one of the things that makes me optimistic about productivity in the UK is that I think that we may be in the midst of a kind of lag between the sort of deployment and extraction of productivity, and that what we will see in coming years is better productivity as the effects of technological change are fully realised.
Thanks, Ian. And I know, Chris, this is obviously a topic very close to your heart and a critical part of the ambition for Made Smarter. What are your perspectives around some of these opportunities to drive productivity and this idea about a lag?
I think the first thing I would say is in the Made Smarter report in 2017, we highlighted the importance of digitalization in terms of its relationship to productivity. So at a national level, you'll see that not only are we lagging behind in productivity and flatlining, as Ian and others have mentioned, but the amount of digitalization, so the exploitation of technology in the UK is not the same as comparative countries. So there's an opportunity with technology that exists now to start to catch up from that productivity challenge. The second piece I would say is what I would sort of describe as sort of enabling the future. I think there is an opportunity for new business models. There is also, if I look at manufacturing and the supply chain purposes, not just to make today's existing world a little bit better, but to try and create better products, better services, and so on in the future. And if I think of all the different national programs that I'm aware of, or big capability programs, all of them will need advanced manufacturing and supply chain capability. All of that can be supported and enabled by good use of digital technology and the solutions that underpin some of that. So I think there's a sort of future perspective. If you think fast forward to 10 years and think about new products, new services, all the things that will come from the sustainability and net zero, ethical, and all those kind of pressures that people are seeing across all sectors. The future, we have to think about how to enable that future and how the UK can take advantage of that. In general, I would say, agree with Jan's point around integration, both internally and supply chain end-to-end integration is something that we certainly have a shared perspective on. And the use of technology will enable people to have better transparency for lots of different reasons through their value chains or through their organizations, to allow better collaboration internally to create better outcomes and better solutions, but to be able to do things like see down your supply chain, to understand its ethical heritage, understand any disruptions that might come into your supply chain that everybody's experienced currently, to allow you to optimize and integrate that system better. So I think there's lots of opportunities for people to do both now and in future solutions that we need to create.
Thanks, Chris. And as we are focused on UK manufacturing today, there is a particular topic where we appreciate getting your perspective, Ian. So through COVID-19, I think firstly, there have been some fantastic examples of UK manufacturing stepping up to the plate, so things like the UK ventilator challenge and others. But it's clear that the pandemic has exposed some challenges around global supply chains and so on. And there is talk around, a potential move around repatriation of manufacturing to the UK. Ian, what's your perspective on that? How viable is that concept? And is supply chain localization something that you would anticipate happening more in future?
Well, I think you're certainly right that this tremendous sort of health and economic crisis has stress tested all sorts of systems, including supply chains. And there's been a lot of talk about the need for greater resilience. I think that, in a sense, what surprises me is just how resilient these supply chains have been, actually. And I think that a lot of the problems are not really, so if we look at personal protective equipment, the problem's not been a diversification of supply chains and overseas supplies. It's just been the huge unanticipated demand. Food supply chains in the UK have remained, and food manufacturing has remained remarkably resilient. I think one of the other features of this debate about supply chains is, of course, geopolitical. It's not to do with this crisis. It's about issues to do with national security, and you see it clearly in the debate about the role of Huawei and the supply of 5G kit to Western countries. So that geopolitical side, I think certainly the crisis is going to lead to a greater focus and awareness of the need for resilience, although resilience can actually be increased by having a diversity of supply chains rather than a reliance on a single supplier. I think the other longer term change, if we think about manufacturing, is that a lot of manufacturing was offshored and has been over decades in search of cheaper labour. And as the labour component of manufacturing declines, and as the kind of cost arbitrage between labour in the West and labour in countries like China, where labour costs have risen a lot, where that cost arbitrage narrows, you start to see a chance for manufacturing to move back to countries like the UK and the US. And it's very interesting in the States. See, Trump has made a big thing about bringing manufacturing jobs back. Actually, manufacturing employment in the States has risen by about 12% since 2010. Don't really think it's much to do with Donald Trump. I just think it's due to the nature of production. So I think that supply chain resilience is one part of this story, but I think the other part, and probably a bigger part, is the change in the nature of manufacturing, which means that it's less labor intensive and therefore is more amenable to production in countries like the UK and the US.
Thanks, Ian. And I think given that outlook and some of the opportunities that Jan's talked to and so on as well, it seems that there is really a government imperative and opportunity that might be seized here. And so, Chris, perhaps you can just share what is it that the UK government is doing to stimulate and support industry, and what are some of the key priorities that you're looking at?
Yeah, so I can touch a little bit on what the government is doing more broadly, but more in depth really on the innovation part of that. I think on the innovation part, when Ian was speaking, I'm thinking one of the things we need to do is create the manufacturing and supply chains of the future, as opposed to sort of argue about resourcing existing ones. There's definitely more opportunities for us to try and do that and leverage the capability we have. So you might see, for example, electrification of vehicles, the development and exploitation of better battery technology and its manufacturing in the UK, as opposed to making combustion engines and so on. There's an opportunity for us to stake a claim to really grow the manufacturing footprint around the future technologies and the future investments that we're making currently on the innovation side. I think, as Ian described, there is some interesting trade-offs. I've seen that in the past where organizations have seen as they increase levels of automation and reduce the labor component, there is opportunities to reshore some of that. Where those things are critical to the nation, critical for life or critical to economy, to steal Jan's terminology, there will be opportunities to bring some of that back. And there's a lot of activity going on from a government point of view to look at what does supply chain resilience mean? What does it mean in terms of manufacturing footprint? What should we have in the UK versus not, and so on. So it's very much an ongoing conversation at the wider level. My innovation focus is really about how do we secure the future supply chains, and how can I, from my challenge perspective, make the manufacturing and supply chain processes absolutely leading edge, such that this is a great place to have your manufacturing and supply chains located.
Thanks, Chris. And I think there's an element about the supply chain for that supply chain itself in the terms of the UK technology industry to support Industry 4 and these productivity improvements and addressing some of these economic challenges. That would seem a pretty important element here. So how easy it's been to find and identify and, I guess, nurture some of that kind of UK technology capability as well?
I think my perspective is probably a little bit sort of double-edged. I think if you look for very large technology players, the ones that support digital manufacturing and digital supply chain, there aren't as many as I would like, and we intend to grow some of those. If I look at the other end of the spectrum and look at the number of applicants we get for competitions or accelerators, whatever it is, and I see all the data that comes, there are hundreds of small technology companies with really exciting ideas and solutions. But they're at the sort of small to medium scale. How do we sort of grow that and nurture that development is one of the key things that we need to try and do. And the other thing that's become apparent in the current crisis, once there's a lot of talk around digitalization and innovation being an absolute imperative for the manufacturing sector, now we need to take the chance to transform it. There has been a reduction in investment in those small scale startup type organizations literally in the last couple of months. So where we do have some funding programs that support those types of companies, we're really keen to get those moving as quickly as we possibly can. So I think in the UK generally, we have lots of capability. We have lots of small technology companies. We've got lots of brilliant people in universities and startups and organizations and so on. What we have to do, I'm trying to help people do, is to foster that and nurture it into much bigger players that can go on to become competitive globally, and be the solution that people across the world will use. These systems that we're developing really do shape how manufacturing and supply chains work, and it's really important that the UK has a strong role in that.
Thanks, Chris. And perhaps we could turn to you, Jan. So I think part of your role is developing supply chain leaders of the future, obviously driving a lot of this innovation. And on the subject of kind of practical steps, perhaps you could share what's your vision around supply chain innovation for the UK and what needs to be done kind of from a practical and real point of view?
So I think there's two sides to this. There's what we can do to actually optimize the existing supply chains of today. And so that's where the digital technologies, and I think we need to be careful about where we talk about digital technologies and the way they've played a role in productivity. To date, when we think about technology and manufacturing, we've tended to think about automation technologies, so advanced manufacturing technologies. And actually, again, in that same productivity study, we actually heard industry manufacturers talking about peak productivity, because actually a lot of our pharma industry, food and drinks industry, they're very automated factories. What we're now talking about is a different type of technology. That digital technology enables connectivity, because that enables us to both optimize internally differently and externally differently. But more importantly, it enables us to transform. And I think both Chris and I share a vision that actually the future of manufacturing will be very different to how it currently looks. That actually some of those divides that we see in the UK, whether that be regional divides, whether that be divides between large companies and small companies. To coin a phrase from Paul Clark, who's the CTO of Ocado, who talks about an internet of atoms. If in the future we can think of every machine as a single entity, if we can think of every vehicle that can move something as a single entity, then actually the future is one of distributed manufacturing networks that will configure in response in real time to consumer demand, which will be a leveler across all fronts. And I think we need to push forward on these two fronts of both optimizing what we currently have, but potentially investing in the right technologies, which is both those around connectivity, but equally around low carbon energy sources, so that we can have, not only a different way of manufacturing, but a different way of manufacturing that also enables us to meet that net zero carbon target too.
Fantastic. And I guess to keep it topical and real as well, what would be your kind of standout example of where you've seen organisations using digital and addressing some of the challenges around either the current pandemic or around Brexit, for example?
So actually, we've done some work with Tata Consumer Products Limited, who you perhaps recognise for Tetley Tea. And we've worked with them over 5 years. Now, technology alone is never the answer. I mean, you're consultants, so we all know about people, process, technology. And we've worked with Tata over the last 5 years or so, looking at buffer management strategy, which sounds very boring. But actually, first of all, we looked at the alignment between commercial strategy and supply chain strategy, because if retailers do high-low promotions, then actually the amount of spare capacity or buffer you need in your supply chain is very different to if a retailer pursues an everyday low price strategy. One is very stable or predictable, so buffers can be small, but if you're going to go for a high-low strategy, you need buffers to be much bigger. And we then used analytics and things to look at then how would you trade off between inventory as a buffer or manufacturing capacity as a buffer. And some of this flies in the face of some of the financial measures around return on capital employed. Now, actually, by adopting these principles of buffer management, when COVID hit, Tata Global Beverages had all their buffers and their manufacturing base right-sized, and they were able to move from third in the market to first in the UK market for tea because they had the flexibility to respond. Similarly, at the same time, they also invested in a new analytics tool called SupplyView that we co-developed with an organisation that's now called SupplyView, which by using this tool to track shipments of their product to Canada, when Canada wanted them to make more because it looked like they were running out, they could stand firm in the faith that they actually had product in the system and they avoided the bullwhip effect. So Tata Consumer Products in two ways use different types of digital technologies to actually manage their supply chain to essentially deliver commercial success.
Fantastic. That sounds awesome, Jan. It would be good to just kind of get some final perspectives on this. We've talked around the kind of the economic climate within the UK and both the challenges and some of the opportunity. We've talked about some of the levers that UK government has available and is making use of to stimulate and support UK industry. And we've also touched on some of the great concepts and opportunities that businesses can have through digital as well. So perhaps we can just have some final comments from each of you on that range of topics just to wrap up today's podcasts. Ian, perhaps your final thought.
To me, what I think is interesting is that if you look at productivity in the UK, we have some of the world's most productive businesses, and they're generally larger businesses. And we also, as Chris said, we have an amazing environment for innovation and for technology. I think what we need to do is be better at generalizing and deploying technologies. And I think there is a real challenge with spreading best practice across a long tail of businesses where productivity tends to be lower. But I'm an optimist. I think we've seen in the past periods where productivity has been in the doldrums and it then catches up. I think that there is a lot of opportunity still to raise productivity. My guess is that if we do this podcast, Nick, in 5 years' time, we'll find that productivity growth has picked up from the levels we've seen in recent years.
Fantastic. A very optimistic note there. Thank you, Ian. Jan, your final thought.
So I'm slightly biased, but I think the answer, maybe in addressing the tail, lies in supply chain productivity and not looking at productivity just of individual firms, but of the supply chains and the supply chain networks within which they reside. Also, just picking up on Ian's point, I also think that we do need to get better at sharing methodologies and approaches and make them available to all. And that's where I do think that the Manufacturing Made Smarter Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund and their new Connected Supply Chain Innovation Hub will have a critical role to play in making those methodologies and actually some of the technology providers a go-to place for everybody, all the firms that want to actually improve their end-to-end supply chain productivity.
Thanks, Jan. And I think that sounds like your cue for a final comment as well, Chris.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Jan and Ian, for those. Yeah, so I think the importance of bringing people together to share best practice and learn the lessons is really important. So a lot of what we try to do on the innovation side is to do some of that, is to bring people together. I think there is an opportunity to move quite quickly in this space. So we've accelerated quite a bit the investment on the innovation side. It's been a very busy summer of launching competitions and other things. I have seen some really exciting examples, for example, around the ventilator challenge, where we received from the digital side how quickly organizations could come together to create some digital solutions or use existing, find some startups to plug the gaps where the capability didn't exist and accelerate the development of that technology. So there's some really interesting examples about how quickly we can move in this space. So we shouldn't feel like just because I have a 5-year program that it needs to take 5 years to really move the needle on these things. The one thing that I just wanted to touch on that there's a really interesting example from the ventilator challenge, but we see it everywhere else, is the people aspect, the acceptance and adoption of some of this technology. We have to make sure that we design it appropriately so it's adoptable and works well with people. And we have to understand there's kind of social, cultural factors that come with the acceptance of technology. As much as we need to work on making the solutions cheaper, more cost effective, there's a two-pronged approach. It's not just better technology. We need to work with the skills of the people and make sure the solutions work in that context. So we're not only about developing better technology, we're about making that properly adopted and having impact. But I'm very optimistic that we can do that.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you all. And I share your optimism there, Chris, as well. So thank you, Ian, Jan, and Chris, and those listening to the podcast today. I look forward to sharing more insights around Industry 4 in the future. These podcasts and further information are available on our website at deloitte.co.uk. In particular, you'll find our Smart Factory study, which provides some practical insights and more examples building on some of those that Jan shared today around productivity challenges. And finally, I hope to see all of you online at the Digital Manufacturing Week this November, where we'll be sharing insights around Smart Factory and all things digital in manufacturing. Thanks for listening and take care.